Hello and welcome back to the Secret Life of Dads podcast with myself, Lawrence, and today we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Faye Begeti. Faye, how are you?
I'm good. Excited to be here.
Very excited to have you here. I do have an introduction for you here. You're a practicing neurology doctor and neuroscientist, medical degree and PhD from the University of Cambridge, and you have over 135,000 followers on social media. That's where I first came across you, actually. You're the brain doctor on social media. I think, sorry, I'm just hugging your book.
Hug it.
Like
Hold it close.
Lawrence put this in before we started, but I'm just hugging. And the author of The Phone Fix. Delighted to join you. So, Faye, I think we'll start with, why are we all so addicted to our phones?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think when we use the word addiction in sort of common language, we mean something separate to what we mean in medical language. So actually, addiction is quite a severe and serious diagnosis. And people who are addicted to either substances or behaviors, it tends to have quite a big impact on them. They tend to suffer a lot, lose jobs, lose relationships, lose finances, become homeless. And I think when we say we are addicted to our phones, we don't necessarily mean that we have or we are afflicted with this medical condition, because we are not. We just mean that we have unwanted behaviors, or we've fallen into an unwanted pattern of using our devices in a way that may be somewhat less intentional and automatic. And this doesn't necessarily fall into the remit of addiction. It falls more into the remit of habits, which we can talk about during this podcast. But one thing that's important to differentiate between these two things is because saying that somebody is addicted is somewhat disempowering, and it stops them using their device well, when in fact a lot of these behaviors and habits can actually be changed. And the other thing I think we have to be mindful of is not to minimize the struggles of people who are facing these addictive disorders by saying that we are addicted to, I don't know, the latest Netflix series or things like that. Just like we wouldn't throw words out there such as, you know, she's anorexic, he's a bit OCD. I think we have to be a little bit more cautious with the way that we have these conversations.
Yeah.
So terribly phrased question from Matthew to start.
Oh, I didn't say
I would
that
have,
at
I would
all.
have said something like, "Why are we habitually reliant on our phones, even though it's not always detrimental to our health and well-being?" Is that a better way of phrasing?
Possibly. I think it's important to know that our brain has different systems, and it has an intentional system and it has an autopilot automatic system. And that autopilot automatic system, called the basal ganglia, is there to support our thinking brain. And anything we tend to repeat tends to be stored in that autopilot system. And this is a great thing for us. For example, when you're learning to drive, you have to think about each maneuver, each movement, and then it becomes somewhat automatic and relaxing, and you can think about something else whilst you're doing it. The issue with our phones is that it is one of our most repeated actions. A lot of studies show that we check our phones over 80 times per day. And if you think you can form a habit of brushing your teeth, which is something you do twice a day, think about what habits you can form if you do something 80 times per day.
Do you know what's interesting? Just there's a section in the book about screen time, and just before I came in, I think on a Monday, I always get a notification, I don't know if you do, about your screen time for the week. And I know it's because we spend so much time, because we do a lot of our work on our phone, but there seems to be an attachment of guilt with screen time. And I know you go into it in the book. Like, what is the importance of understanding screen time? Because I kind of have negative connotations with it. If it pops up on your phone and it's like 5.5 hours last week, and you're like, I seem to have this attachment of guilt with my phone. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think we have a generalized anxiety about the way we spend our time. And also there are a lot of societal expectations. We're expected to sort of be productive. And I think we sort of internalize a lot of those patterns. And I do unpick a lot of those things in the book. So, for example, screen time isn't necessarily always bad. Think of your phone sort of like how you'd think about food. There's an element of the things that we eat out of necessity, and there's things that we do for enjoyment. And none of those things are inherently bad. And if you're using your phone as a tool, whether it is to navigate, whether you're listening to a podcast. I was recently in a neurological conference where we had to vote on various subjects using our phone. That was the the week that I had the highest screen time ever. But that's not necessarily inherently bad. I'm using my phone as a tool. This is what it's designed to do. I think rather than thinking of screen time as a whole, which is not a very useful thing, it'd be the same as somebody giving me, I don't know, totaling up all their medications and saying, here, doctor, take 3 grams of medicine. What I want to know is breaking it down. What do you use it for when? Is it intentional or is it unintentional? And for me, for example, an intentional check of social media, even if that's 40 minutes, outweighs you doing 20 1-minute long checks at times when you want to spend time with your family or you want to be focused. So it's not necessarily about time itself. That is a little bit too oversimplified. And I think we need not to worry too much about the screen time alerts and screen time monitors that pop up on our phones, because we can also develop negative anxiety-induced patterns regarding that.
It happens on social media. Like Instagram have a blocker now. If you've been on for more than an hour, well, I don't know, maybe you have to set it up. I have it on mine. And it's like, you've done an hour today, and it's almost like, oh, great, I feel like a piece of crap because I've been on here for an hour. So I know a lot of social media apps social media is something that we're definitely going to get into as well. But it's interesting seeing that the big tech companies are going, hey, look, you've been on for this amount of time now. Yeah.
I find it I'm kind of torn a bit like Matthew. Initially, I kind of have this negative association with it, thinking, oh, too much screen time. But then when I think about it a little bit more, my life has been liberated in many ways by my phone. I'm able to actually spend more time in and around the house doing work tasks and work bits and bobs. But it comes down to me and us all to self-manage and create those healthy boundaries where we know work stops and family time begins, or vice versa. And I know particularly over COVID and lots of people working from home, but people start saying, are you working from home or are you living at work? And there's this kind of leakage from one element into the other. But again, I have to be really honest with myself and catch myself sometimes and saying, was I using the phone always for purposeful motives around my work needs, or was I just kind of habitually grabbing it and extricating myself from the present moment? It's a turmoil, isn't it? It's a constant storm.
And I think as parents, we're all parents to young children as well. I do catch myself at times if my daughter wants my attention, but I'm just like, I've just got to quickly get back to this work email. And then sometimes there isn't a work email, but I've just picked the phone up out of habit. So I think going back to the start in terms of the guilt, I'm very, very aware now of when I pick up my phone around my daughter. Probably moving us on to the next question. What impact is our smartphones having on our children?
That is a question that has received a lot of media attention, and there isn't exactly a clear-cut answer. I go through the evidence in the book, but what I want to say to fellow parents is that the evidence isn't overwhelming for harm. Definitely not. Some studies, for example, will compare children who have had a smartphone at a young age and children who had a smartphone at a slightly older age, and they'll find differences between them. But what we need to be careful of is that there are many, many family differences of why a child would have a smartphone at a young age. And think about all these things. They might be living in, an area where there's danger around. They may need to be able to have a smartphone to access help. They might be shouldering premature adult-like responsibilities. Their parents may not be able to afford all those after-school clubs that are so freaking expensive, even for me. And screen time might be substituting. Their parents may be struggling with a whole host of other issues, and screen time is just plugging in those gaps. So whilst the digital world is important in mental health, what I see from studies is that the physical world that somebody is in is much, much more important. And if you have a loving family and you are a parent who wants to do the best for their children, I don't want people to worry so much that if they allow their kids some screen time, either on a tablet or TV for those who have young children, or have given them a smartphone, that is, the end. And to a certain degree, a lot of studies show that our expectations become reality in terms of, what we think and what we perceive. So, for example, if you're so worried that oh, I've checked my smartphone too much, I'm not going to be able to fall asleep, or I'm going to be depressed, or I'm going to be anxious. To a certain degree, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's just important to sort of temper down and have quite a balanced conversation about these things.
And it's nice to hear, because alongside your book, I've also read Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation book, and that scared me a little bit. I think the tone of voice in your book to that book, because that book is very much like social media is the end of our generation, like where the parents giving it to them. But yours is kind of like, it's nice to hear that, because we can't get away from the digital world. We can't get away from social media. And it's a question I'm sure that you've had with your partner, like, when do we introduce social media to our children as well? So I think what your book is really good at, it brings a sense of calmness into the digital world and how we develop better digital habits.
Totally. And it's almost, again, that big question of what's the bigger issue to explore? Is it the tech, or is it our reaction to it? And it comes down to so much self-management, as you say, in the physical world, and everything has context. And I just feel already, I feel better. The fact that, we kind of normalize that it's okay for screen time, because it's very much in our minds as a family at the moment. I have a 7-year-old daughter and an almost 5-year-old son. And like yesterday was Sunday, we were trying to get that right combination between spending time outdoors and playing, and then those little segments in between with screen time as well. And I would say it's the number one conversation that my wife and I are having at the moment is, how do we get the right balance? How do we kind of use it for our benefit and their benefit, and without kind of disturbing from any of again, we're imprinting our own bias upon it as parents according to our own experiences, but how do we give them the best means to kind of grow up in a natural way, considering tech is going to be a huge part of their lives going forward, and our children will experience tech in ways that we can't even fathom at the moment as well. So not to completely deprive them of managing it as they grow.
Yeah, I completely I completely agree with that. I think when you think about children and screen time, there are two important issues to sort of consider. Content, what they're accessing, and sort of parental controls and things like that. And the other thing is habits. And there's a lot of push in the media for avoidance of smartphones whilst they're young, but a lot of this content can be accessed in a whole variety of devices. And it is our responsibility as parents to make sure that it's age-appropriate content. And that's not necessarily a completely new problem, because when I grew up, laptops were available, but also I was an advanced reader, and sometimes I read books that were sort of not really suitable. And one was quite scary, for example, gave me nightmares. So it's not necessarily that it's just technological content. But the other thing is habits. And how do we give our kids a pattern of behavior to be encoded into their autopilot brain, that they'll be able to use technology to serve them for their purpose, but in addition be able to maintain focus, sleep well, and safeguard their mental health. And there is a lot of conversation of kick the can down the road, don't give a smartphone till X age. There's no evidence to suggest that that's good or bad, to be honest with you. But from my experience, I mean, all of us millennials, for example, wouldn't have had a phone. The smartphones came out when I was 19. I probably didn't get one that year. But there's a lot of millennials that didn't get phones till after the age of 18, into their 20s, that have developed a lot of problematic habits. So it doesn't necessarily safeguard to just say, oh, I'm just going to leave them till that age. We have to teach them that pattern of behavior that's useful, just like we would teach them to brush their teeth.
I think that's a key point, isn't it? It's kind of management and integration, and not to go cold turkey until they're. It's like the alcohol thing, isn't it? It's sort of, again,
it's
different
the dose
ways.
that makes the poison.
Yeah, and when we were in our kind of teenage years, instead of having alcohol completely banned, and all of a sudden we were unleashed upon alcohol at the age of 18, we were allowed to have slightly diluted wine at the dinner table and everything else. But it just reminds me of that.
So what is it? You know, when you go out and you've misplaced your smartphone and it almost feels like you've lost a limb. Because I think there's been studies done on this, hasn't there? Where people, they forget their smartphone somewhere, and it's like they've actually, it feels like you've lost a part of you. What happens in your brain?
I think we rely on our smartphone for so many things. I mean, if you've misplaced your smartphone, at least today, I would have misplaced my train ticket, my ability to pay, my Google Maps, my ability to do directions. And I think we have to remind ourselves that these things do make our life easier. In a way, we romanticize the past to a degree, but it was actually growing up in a pre-smartphone era where you have to arrange to meet your friend at a particular place. And if one of you got that wrong, then you had no way of contacting them besides calling their landline from a phone box. And that I've had occasions where this has happened and we've been like an hour apart. And it wasn't necessarily the greatest thing that people make it out to be. I think what people romanticize is that it was a simpler life. And I think that's a different issue to the technology itself, in that we have increasing societal demands. We're expected to do a whole host of work, and we are sort of plugging in the gaps by answering emails in every single spare moment we have on the tube or right before we go into this Zoom meeting or whatever. And I think that's a different conversation to the technology itself.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about almost two types of thinking, like automatic. And is that similar to, I've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, type 1 and type 2 thinking. Am I looking at the right topic here? So, so when we're kind of, when our part of our brain, our really kind of analytical, critical part of our brain is really scrutinizing over information or being fed lots of information, it's kind of trying to problem solve on the go, versus the more subconscious, I guess, part of our thinking that's more automatic, as you say, if we're driving along the motorway. Is there a ratio, is there a healthy ratio that we're meant to, or most people are meant to exist between the percentage of thinking, which is our conscious problem-solving, critical thinking, versus our automatic, more subconscious thinking?
So, I mean, studies have shown that on average, around 40% of what we do relies on this autopilot part of the brain, relies on habits. So a lot of things that we do, even the way I'm talking at the moment, the way I use my hands, all of that relies on habits, the way you drive, the way you might get dressed in the morning. Anything that you've done plenty of times before tends to be quite habitual. And the thing to know about that intentional, complex thinking part of our brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex behind our forehead, is that it doesn't have unlimited mental energy. And studies show that if you get people in a lab and you get one group to do complex tasks, and to be fair, they're not even really that complex compared to what we do in our day-to-day life, and you get people to do simple tasks, and you get them to do that for a number of hours, what you see is blood flow to that part of the brain reduces. And this is a concept that I talk about in the book, where I say that we go into a sort of low power mode of sorts, where our brain sort of tries to conserve energy, and blood flow has reduced, and we are more likely to act on our habits in those scenarios. So whatever you've encoded on your autopilot brain, good or bad, you're more likely to act upon it, because that part of the brain is a lot more ancient and it's a lot less fatigable as it is that intentional, complex thinking part of the brain that's most developed in humans.
So this is my question, to link that to what we were talking about in terms of when we didn't have tech and, you know, people were a bit more relaxed, or either I meet you there at this time or I don't, and maybe an hour passes, versus now where everything's so instantaneous, we can cram so much more into our day, there's so much more information for the critical thinking part of our brain to compute. Does that put us at risk of almost over fatiguing the prefrontal cortex and its functions and destabilizing our capacity to think in any way?
I think so. I think there is a trend to people trying to do more and more and more things that we didn't do 20 years ago. There were jobs that weren't even available. For example, think about social media, and everybody has a social media account and is posting things, sometimes in addition to their normal 9-to-5 job. And I think a lot of people are functioning in lower power mode. And it's not necessarily just tech itself. It's the fact that we have sort of an increased trend for example, for both parents to be working, but at the same time have to manage childcare. We have, more nuclear families. We have less support. For example, me and my husband were both doctors. We have no family around close by to manage that childcare side of things. And having to manage all these multiple responsibilities, I think, does fatigue people and put them in low power mode. And one of the things that they even showed in the study, that you're more likely to make sort of impulsive short-term choices in that state. And of course, when your device is right near you, rather than doing something that will benefit you in the long term, you would do something that benefits you in the short term, whether that's scrolling or whatever other pattern of behavior you have encoded.
That's it. I'm in low power mode.
You're always in low power mode.
I feel like I'm in low power mode. I'm just forgetting names quite easily at the moment. You know, it's like people's names.
Matt.
Matt.
It's Matt. Yeah.
That makes sense now.
Faye, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. As a neuroscientist, when will you be giving smartphones to your children?
I haven't got a specific age in mind. This is my honest answer. I haven't got a specific age in mind. I am not worried about the age.
You're not?
No, I'm not worried about the age. I'm more keen on giving my eldest, Lyra, when I give her a smartphone, is to help her use it well. I'm not just going to give her a smartphone and say, here you go.
There's
see
a
you
TikTok
later.
account. Yeah.
Yeah. See you later. Yeah, you know, it's more about introducing it slowly, having certain boundaries, age-appropriate content. For example, one of the things is that I'm going to try develop loads of habits around focus and loads of habits around sleep. These are kind of the things that I didn't know when I was young. Obviously, I've done a neuroscience PhD and I'm a neurology doctor now, but I used to stay up till 3 a.m. watching TV. I had a TV in my bedroom. Maybe I didn't have a smartphone, but all these other things were available to me. But I'm going to, my ethos is to give her the tools, but help her use them correctly. And I think that's what makes people stand out. But I'm not worried about them watching more TV on some days that we're not going out. I'm not worried about any of that at all, actually. And I think approaching this subject with less guilt is also really, really important as parents. We have so many things we're told that we need to be guilty about, whether it's food or technology or extracurricular activities. And I think to raise happy children, you have to let go of some of that guilt and just be happy in the presence and with the amazing things that we have around us.
Oh, that's so refreshing.
That's so true.
That makes me feel so much better.
Yes.
Because I don't know why. There just seems to be a label around 16 years old is when you get a smartphone, or 18 years old. But there's also, it's detrimental as well, because I'm very aware that when my daughter goes into school, they're going to be using iPads and they're going to be using this tech. So part of me doesn't want her to be left behind as well. So I'm very conscious of that.
Yes, and actually, there are some studies that show, for example, communicating with friends and texting friends is no bad thing. And we certainly did that. We had MSN Messenger and things like that, whilst we may not have had a smartphone. I think, and then, so smartphone is one thing with parental controls, and social media is a different story, which the minimum age is 13. But I think when going onto social media, when children are sort of younger, they're under your guidance. You can sort of instruct them and tell them what to do. They look up to you, and not necessarily what you say, but what you do as well. So I think it's important at that age to have a discussion around the content, see what content they're watching. It's not a case of here's a smartphone and do whatever you want with it. But in a way, that will be the case if you wait till the age of 18. They will either start a job or go to university, and there is no monitoring or discussions that can be had after that point. I mean, maybe there are, but you know, our children have become adults. In a way, they're gonna find their own way. When we have that magical opportunity to kind of work with them and say, look, these are different types of content. How is this helping you, or do you feel this is making you feel bad? Empowering them to only follow accounts that will be useful, because there are many accounts that are useful out there.
Well, I've already messed up because my kids have started watching YouTube where they're doing all these pranks on the parents at home. And now I literally walk around the corner and I'll have like a bow and arrow or something, or a glass of water thrown at me. So
I'm going to start doing that.
once you open up Pandora's box, you've got to be careful.
But you talk a lot in the book about dopamine. Well, not a lot, but there's a good section to it. And I know, did you do your PhD on dopamine as well? Why are we like the media's so obsessed with dopamine, like dopamine crazy, like anytime you go. I remember hearing something once when you scroll down on your phone, it's similar to the slot machines that you get in Vegas, that scrolling, and you get some sort of reward back to it. And that's what scrolling is like through social media. Why are we so obsessed with dopamine?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like dopamine has won the PR award in terms of neurotransmitters. Yeah, and that sort of hold and release that is the same as Vegas, that is all nonsense. Completely different muscles and things like that will be activated. Most of the people that are doing that and refreshing Instagram in that way are doing so out of habit. They're not getting any major reward. In fact, once habits are encoded into our mind, they do become slightly, what we say, reward insensitive. They're not so reliant on reward. So when you're forming a habit, and that's a useful tip for people to know, whether you're going out for a run or you're trying to eat new healthy food, reward is very important in the initial stages of creation. But once you've been doing something for ages, months, let's say, it's somewhat reward insensitive, and that's why people will go for a run. That's because what they're used to doing, even though it might be pouring with rain outside. Whereas if you're in those early stage where the habit hasn't formed, you might just say, no, thanks. But if you've been doing that for years, and that's your thing to do. And actually, when it comes to our phones, because of the repetition, a lot of people have encoded habits that are relatively reward resistant. And a lot of times they actually find their behavior very, very frustrating. They're not getting much reward. If you're checking Instagram and it's the 60th time you've done so in that hour, there really isn't that much new to be gained. And it's a frustrating behavior, but it's become more sort of like an automatic action.
Yeah.
So I think... I don't think there is a massive sort of dopamine release as people say in the media. Important to know that a lot of the dopamine studies are done in animals. We implant things in their brains to be able to measure dopamine. When you come to measuring dopamine in humans, they have to undergo scanners, and you tend to get a more sort of broad perspective on the dopamine pathway to diagnose conditions such as Parkinson's disease. I cannot tell if you've had a dopamine spike from your phone. There is no way that we can tell that. So a lot of that is hypothesis and inference. And in fact, if you do find something rewarding on your phone, it's probably similar to having a rewarding food or petting a dog. It's the same sort of neurotransmitter pathways. There is nothing inherently scary about it.
Is it just people wanting to be distracted from boredom or the present moment, or people just feeling uncomfortable and sitting in the present moment and just simply being, present, being away from the stories that the mind's kind of taking them on, and this kind of mental time travel that we all love to do so much, isn't it? Is it some sort of escape from that? And what is going on in the brain at that particular moment, and why do we all want to be distracted from the present moment so much?
I mean, it depends. I think I talk a lot about emotion regulation in the book, and sometimes little moments of boredom and frustration, our brain is able to deal with it. But if you offer an alternative, and you repeat that alternative, then that becomes a habit, and then that's something that you continuously do. The other thing to note is that sometimes if people do have sort of mental issues and mental disorders, the phone can provide a form of digital emotion regulation, a form of escapism, a form of distraction. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on the way that it's used and the context.
Everything's context, isn't it? I love that.
So there's a section in the book that I really, really like in terms of adding consequences. So, because it's very habitual when I pick up my phone, and I know sometimes I don't need to be on it. I've just said, oh God, I've picked this up. And maybe can you talk a little bit more about the consequences section of the book? You mentioned that if you go on social media, you've got to leave a comment on somebody's post, or if you go through your emails, you've got to clear out your inbox. So if you read a news article, you've got to thoroughly read the news article. And I really, really like that, because it's so easy to just scroll, take in so much information, and then just get on with it. Can you talk a little bit more about consequences?
Yeah, I mean, there are 4 components when it comes to forming habits. And I talk about those in the books, is reminders, really small action, reward, and repetition. And the consequences really acts on the really small action bit of the habit puzzle. And you have to break all those things apart if you are to reprogram your behavior. A lot of the time, people check their phone and it becomes automatic because it's such a tiny action. We're logged into all our apps. It's so easy. It's right next to us. You'll hit a stumbling block. Let's just say you're writing a text. You'll hit a stumbling block, and that'll be your automatic reaction. By adding consequences, you are making that action a bit bigger and a bit bulkier for the brain to really make it less habitual. So, for example, if you're one of those people that checks their emails, I don't know, every 5 minutes, and you no longer want to be doing that, adding some consequences, I mean, any new emails, you read them, you reply to them, that's done. Your brain starts to realize it's no longer a really small action, me just checking my emails. I'm no longer using it as escapism from the task. I'm creating work for myself. and you tend to start to do it less and more intentionally. And there's ways you can do that with social media. Like I say, a lot of people just go on, do a quick refresh, and then get back to
They're
work.
not social on it, are they? Like, so
Exactly,
many people
yeah.
use social media these days. I'm not social on it. I just want to check what you're doing or check what Faye's doing.
I just want everyone to check what you're doing, Matthew.
Yeah.
Quick look at your
And to
story.
be fair, that's an even worse thing, I would say, is if you've posted something, and a lot of content creators might do that, and then just refresh your likes.
Totally.
So not only
Yeah.
you're not checking what anybody else is doing, you are literally just saying,
Just
oh,
talking
it's
to you,
100,
right?
or it's gone to 200, or it's gone to 300.
Yeah.
That is not useful. That is not useful. That is a little bit of sort of, it can become quite a compulsive behavior. And I
Yeah.
talk about that in the social media chapter, how you can break that apart.
Feels like-
Sorry.
Not just something that's linked to external validation, isn't it? And this constant want to check up.
Yeah, what are your views on likes on social media? Are they helpful? Because a lot of people will put something up and maybe they've put their heart and soul into it. Speaking from personal experience, you put your heart and soul into a piece of content and it just falls flat on its face. How helpful or detrimental are likes?
Yeah, it's a really big question. It's really difficult to answer. I think we have to uncouple how good a piece of content is and what our self-worth is from the numerical value. And in a way, I learned to do that quite early on in my research, because you have research that hits the media, it's on BBC News, but that's not necessarily the most important research. It's the most media-worthy research, is what somebody can make a nice story out of. So I think I learned that early on in my career, and I think I've carried that through to Instagram, in that I can produce something that's really valuable and it not have many likes. And that's absolutely okay. The issue with chasing likes and using them as a metric is that they are just a proxy of value. They do not necessarily indicate value. That's why we get clickbait content. Is that people thinking, how many clicks can I get? And then you get the most bizarre, untrue headlines. And then fine, you've got loads of clicks, but was there real value in that? And I think we need to, in a way, we neuroadapt. And as somebody gets bigger on social media, for example, I don't know, maybe 50 likes, just arbitrary numbers would have been enough, but now it has to be 1,000. So it's just important to just have some perspective, not to worry. I think have faith that your content is valuable, and even if it has big value for a small number of people, that's a good thing. Whereas it could have lots of likes but have very little value. It's just loads of people double tapped it.
As a neuroscientist, if you had the ability to remove the like section on Instagram, would you do it?
I'm not sure. In a way, there are some good things in that, if you put a post about mental health and dads, for example, the fact that you can see that thousands of people have liked it is value. We all have different types of comparisons that we make with each other. And there is a type of comparison called lateral comparison, when you see that you're in the same boat and you can relate with other people. So I'm not sure whether I necessarily would, but I can see that there are many problematic aspects. I think we just need to reframe. I think we need, for both ourselves and young people, to reframe and become more resilient to these external metrics, because after all, they're everywhere. They're everywhere in terms of sort of anything else that we use, whether it's, I don't know, calorie counters, step counters, things like that. I think we need to have some more intrinsic self-worth. So I'd rather build ourselves up rather than trying to change our environment.
That's the ideal, isn't it? I mean, we all fall into the pitfall of kind of comparison. It's human nature and so on. But the ideal is to authentically know your truth, to the point that when you're being creative true to yourself. And as soon as it's put out to the world, the work is done, you move on, you don't go back and check and compare. But we all do it. We all kind of fall into those moments. I wanted to ask you something that follows on from the point you were making earlier as well. So I've started to try to do this thing where I will, if it's family time, so I've clocked off for work, as it were, for the day. If I want to use my phone, and you were talking about consequences earlier, I will allocate myself a room that if I need to do something with my phone, I have to leave wherever I am. I have to go into that room, say it's my office, and then I have to use my phone. The idea being that it stops the kind of aimless scrolling, as you say, or just habitually picking it up when I'm meant to be, or it would be preferable for me to be more present with my family, let's say. So I have to go to that room because I have to send an email or I meant to reply to someone's message or someone. Are there any other kind of hacks, if that's the word to use, that you could suggest to help people implement consequences into their lives like that?
So firstly, I really love that idea, and I actually do talk about it in the book, because when we store habits, there are two main things that happen. They're very location and time specific. For example, you only brush your teeth in the bathroom in the morning and the evening, those specific times. You wouldn't think about brushing your teeth in the kitchen or in the middle of the
Or
day.
on the podcast.
So yeah. So it's, whereas, you know, with our phones being so portable, we've turned to develop habits in all sorts of locations. So being location specific is a really good thing. And anybody who's introducing text to kids, for example, not having certain technology in the bedroom is a good idea, for example, or at least if you allow them to watch sort of passive content TV, maybe not social media in those places in your home. The other thing, so we need to instigate better boundaries when it comes to work and home life. And because a lot of people work remotely on their phones in a really portable manner, it makes it quite difficult to do. I think in terms of, for example, social media apps, logging out is a really, really good idea when you reach the end of the day. So at the beginning of the day, especially if a lot of work is on social media, you log in, you do what you need to do. But at the end of the day, you log out. You are free to log back in and do something, but at least encountering that login screen activates that intentional thinking part of your brain saying, do I really want to do this? Or can this wait till the next day? Can I just write it down on a piece of paper? And it also makes the action slightly bigger. So you're less likely to do it out of habit without realizing you've picked up your phone and suddenly you're scrolling. But I'm really keen on this location side of things. And for people who work from home, who may not have a dedicated office, having certain objects around that makes it your office, whether it's a picture, a quote, it can be anything. And then you pack those away at the end of the day.
Going back to we were speaking about habits. How long does it take to form a new habit? Because normally when you read this, it's 21 days, right? But that's not quite true, is it?
So 21 days, I'm not 100% sure where it came from, but it was like self-help books in the 60s, definitely not based on science. There are some scientific studies that say 66 days, but it's always important to remember that it's an average. So if you were to start a habit of drinking a glass of water with your breakfast, that is a lot easier than, for example, going for a 5K run, right? It's a lot easier. It takes 1 minute, kitchen tap's right there. And of course, what is even easier than that would be, I don't know, having a pastry, a nice croissant for your breakfast. That would happen, being coded a lot faster. There's certain components of habits that make them easier to form. And this is where the 4 different components of the habit puzzle come in. So we have reminders and how many things in your life, either times, locations, people, internal states, moods, trigger you to do that thing that you want to do, how big of an action it is. And if it's a really small action, it'll become a habit quicker. That's what we might say to somebody, just lace up your shoes and just get out even for 1 minute, lower the thresholds of what you want to create. And then the next 2 things are reward and repetition, okay? And they are part of the saving process. So the more reward you have when you do a habit, the less repetition you need. If it's not very rewarding, you'll need more repetition. So just thinking about things that people intrinsically find rewarding, we're all somewhat different. And I think, when you have a study that says an average amount of days, it really doesn't do justice to the complexity of our own brains.
I love that. Does that link into habit stacking as well, and just how hard it is to go from, because habits or actions that serve us, I guess, are somewhere on a spectrum between ones that negatively impact and those that really help us. And so often people, I think, in a moment of high motivation, try to jump too far up that spectrum and they miss all of the kind of stacking, and it's very hard to get that quantum leap going. So starting small and building from there, I think is great advice. And from a fitness point of view, of just thinking of fitness and people wanting to start fitness habits and so on.
You wouldn't tell them to run a marathon straight away, would you?
No,
exactly.
Exactly. And I just loved your example of saying, just tie your shoelaces up and get out the front door. The first step's often the hardest one to take. On that specifically, I have to talk about fitness for a little bit, even though it's slightly going off on a tangent. But But do you have advice for someone who's looking to start a fitness habit but is struggling? What advice would you give them to kind of get that initial spark, to get the reward they need to buy into it, to have that emotional belief, and then ultimately to sustain it over a meaningful period of time as well?
So I think lowering the bar is a really important thing to do, because sometimes people feel that, oh, I don't have enough time to do something meaningful. Even if you don't have half an hour, even if you don't have 15 minutes, doing something is better than doing nothing. And what you need is you need to achieve a certain amount of repetition for it to be coded into your brain as a habit. So think of all those missed opportunities that, oh, I only have 20 minutes. That's fine. Do a 5-10 minute workout. Maybe it won't, hugely change your physique. Maybe you won't be able to see the difference, although you can. Even 5 minutes actually adds up to 5 minutes a day is 30 hours per year that you wouldn't have done. But even if you weren't able to see the change in your body, you can see the change in your brain because you are consistently repeating, and that sort of cements the networks, and it makes it easier for you to start the next time. So even if you were, like I said, can't do a full workout, do those small incremental repetitions.
Love that. So my next question, what happens to the brain when we do exercise and work out?
Yeah, so amazing things happen. So one of the things that I talk about a lot to my patients is that you get release of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's called BDNF. It's a lovely nourishing chemical for our nerve cells. And it's very, really important to keep our nerve cells healthy. And studies actually show that even people who have a neurodegenerative disease where these nerve cells die, like Parkinson's disease, one of the things that I've done research on, exercising releases this chemical and keeps the remainder of the nerve cells healthy. There is no other way to replace this chemical. We have no drugs or anything else that we can use to replace it. So exercise is one of those great things that can help our brain.
Wow.
Goodness, that is massive.
Is there, just on that note, is there a particular type of exercise, aerobic, strength training, that's better?
So both are important and both have different benefits for our brain and body. So aerobic exercise tends to look after our blood vessels. A lot of people think about blood vessels in the heart and preventing heart attacks, but of course we have blood vessels throughout the rest of our bodies, especially the ones going to our brain, so you can prevent strokes. You can prevent tiny damage, just not enough to cause strokes, but can destroy the blood vessels and cause something called vascular dementia due to problem in blood vessels. So that's aerobic exercise. Also helps our bones, and it's important for movement later on in life. And of course, resistance training is very important. People show that if you're active every single decade of your life, doesn't matter how active you are, just make it every single decade, they tend to live longer, they have less incidence of dementia and strokes and loads of other, conditions that we want to avoid.
Your brain is amazing, by the way. Wow.
I would love to, and I hope this doesn't sound weird, somehow, like with one of those USB ports, just download everything you know into my awareness and just experience it for 10 minutes.
Oh my God. Can we talk a little bit about multitasking, please? I feel like, when you've got your computer open these days and there's like 50 million tabs, or actually, I remember growing up, not just growing up, but is there evidence to show that women are better at multitasking than men? Or is that just like an old wives' tale, first of all?
Old wives' tale. Myth, myth. And I'll tell you what, I really hate that particular myth because...
Where's that come from?
I don't know. I've got no idea. Maybe somebody can write in and tell us where it's come from. But it is definitely a myth. There are studies disputing this. Our brain, whilst there are differences between the sexes, does function very, very similarly. And it's important not to say, my partner, who is female, is better at multitasking, so I let her sort out everything to do with school.
Oh, damn it.
I see where he was going with this.
Did I ruin your plans? Did I ruin your plans?
We'll cut this bit out.
Will never be broadcast.
Wow. So what are the fundamental differences between men's brains and women's brains?
I mean, there are some differences, but I think it's important to note that they are quite small. It's not, if I look in a scan, I don't say, oh, that's a male brain, that's a female brain.
Yeah.
So I think we are more similar than, people, how we're led to believe. But there are a lot of societal constructs around gender and the way we behave that are important to talk about. For example, this is a podcast aimed at dads, and it'd be worth talking about dads and their emotions and things like that. So if I was to, for example, I mean, most people don't really understand when, we say that, emotions, what does that even mean? So we have an emotional brain. There are 2 almond-sized areas in our brain called the amygdala, some neuroscience learning for you. And they're activated when we experience strong emotions. And they tend to have a negative bias, so they're more activated by negative emotions than positive ones. This happens in everybody, and that's, it's a survival mechanism. If you were to have a near miss, you'd rather encode that stronger to be able to avoid it and survive than if it was something great has happened. So we have these amygdala. Emotions lead to activation. It's important to know that people who have mood disorders, anxiety, depression, sometimes they're genetically predetermined to have an overactivation of this brain area. And then we have the intentional thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that we talked about. And that tends to be a more rational part of the brain. It tends to rationalize these emotions. It tends to integrate input from our memory centers, various parts of the brain, and regulate our emotions. And that's called emotion regulation. If we do that internally with our own brain, it's called internal emotion regulation. But if somebody's brain is struggling to regulate their own emotions, either because the amygdala are overactivated or their intentional brain is struggling through being in low power mode or having a condition such as ADHD, for example, then you have this thing called external emotion regulation, where you can talk to somebody about your issues and you can use the power of their brain to sort of untangle those emotions. So if you've ever experienced something and then talking to somebody else has helped, that's what's happening there. They've not experienced it, so they're not in that state of emotion activation, and they can use their rational brain to help yours. Just like if you were, to have a physical issue, you could rely on somebody or a physical aid or somebody for support. And I think this is a big difference in men and women, in that women may talk about the emotional element of being a mother a lot more than dads do to each other. But that is an important thing to do, and it's important asking the questions. Am I not talking about my emotions because I don't need to when I'm fine, or is it because there's a societal construct saying I mustn't, I must appear strong and never say I'm struggling to anybody else?
Why do men find it harder to talk about their emotions than women?
I think part of it is the way we have been brought up. We tend to mimic the behaviors around us. Our brain, is born naive. It has no preconceived expectations. But as we grow up, whether it's girls or boys, we are taught to behave in certain different ways. And I think in a way that is being unpicked somewhat. I think there is a lot of positive male mental health campaigns saying, you should talk about your feelings and talk about things like that, which I think that's good progress.
So is that fascinating? It's almost a sort of, is it cathartic, a cathartic process, at play with regards to that part of the brain actually being able to process and almost release, the let's say trauma that's experienced in the past. And then that links on to my next question around, you mentioned the vagus nerve earlier, and this is something I'd love to unpick and hear a little bit more, because people talk a lot about the brain-body connection and how mental trauma, for instance, can be manifested physically through the vagus nerve. Is this myth? Is this something that has something real that we could look at? And I'd love to hear more about that.
Not necessarily just the vagus nerve, but the brain controls everything that happens in our body. So there's a center in your brain called the brainstem that will control your breathing rate. It'll control your heart rate. It'll control loads of various functions in your body, digestion, things like that. And I think if people have experienced trauma and specific adverse life experiences, what happens is, in terms of the amygdala, it tends to be overactivated. And I talk about sort of other ways the brain can change with stress in my book. And a lot of these things can manifest physically. And we do see this in clinic quite a lot with a lot of neurological conditions, specifically something called functional neurological disorders, where people can experience a lot of bodily sensations, tingling, numbness, abnormal movements, weakness. And that's because of that brain has been activated, and it's how it's interpreting sensations when it comes to that.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
It's really fascinating. There's a section of the book that I really, really enjoyed about sleep, just because, I feel like I haven't slept in 3 years because I've got a 2-year-old. And I know how frustrating it can be when you haven't slept. I know they use, sleep deprivation is used as a torture technique, and I can absolutely see why. What is the impact what impact are smartphones having on our quality of sleep?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Again, no specific clear-cut evidence or something that can apply to everybody. It really does depend on the way that we use smartphones. So one of the things about sleep to mention is that it's really hard when you're a parent. It has so many functions, but one of the things that it does, it restores that executive intentional part of the brain that we talked about. So there's large studies pulling loads and loads of evidence that show that if you sleep less, you have less self-control. You're more likely to act on your automatic habits. And because that part of the brain is also regulating our emotions, you're more likely to be emotionally labile. No, exactly. Well, some people manifest this outwards, and we all know somebody who's, when they're tired, they get cranky and irritable.
Not me.
Mate,
Don't look at me.
On Saturday, our daughter hasn't slept well the whole week, and I was cleaning out the coffee machine, and it was falling, and I had a fight with the coffee machine because I hadn't slept for a week. Which I would never have a fight with the coffee machine.
Did you feel better afterwards?
No, I felt worse because my wife just turned to me and said, "Are you okay?" It made me feel terrible.
You had to buy a new coffee machine as well.
Yes, Nespresso. If you're listening, I need a new coffee.
So that can happen. That is a very common consequence of sleep deprivation. And somebody who's really, really running on low power mode, they can do things like shout at their children or tell them off. And we've all been there in occasions. And think about why that's happening. It's because you've been stressed, not slept, not had a break. And that rational emotional part of your brain, the rational part of the brain that's trying to regulate all those emotions, is not functioning as well as it should. And it's worth talking about these things. So I think we've all done it. I've done it as a neuroscience and a neurology doctor. And it's important to put sort of mechanisms in place to support yourself so these things don't happen.
Boarding school.
So is this, what has been popularly coined as the term baby brain? Right? Have you ever heard of this phrase?
Yeah.
So when our youngest was a baby, my wife, I was sat there just having lunch, and my wife started to put, one of those baby bibs that catches the food, and she started putting it around my neck, and literally for about 20 seconds was just not kind of thinking, and then she paused and realized what she was doing, and I was kind of staring at her, and we had this big outburst laughing, saying that's the baby brain because we haven't had enough sleep. But she was literally deep into this task of getting me set up as a baby at the table.
Did you have a giant nappy on as well?
Yes, and I just had that on.
I forgot to mention that bit. Was it your first or your second child?
That was our second.
Yes, she's okay. So that makes perfect sense to me because she's already has these habits that are deeply encoded from the first child, and with the second child, we all know it. Not only you can't sleep, but then you've got to get the eldest child up for various things, and when that intentional brain kind of goes offline, is in lower power mode, you're more likely to act on your habits. And in this case, there was a complete misapplication of a habit. Do you know what I mean? But these things can happen.
I love that misapplication.
Yeah, but she was acting on autopilot mode, and I've done silly things with my second child. Nothing as funny, I'm afraid. But for example, twice I put a sleep suit without putting a nappy. Once I realised, and I thought, something's not right here. But once I realised in the middle of the night when we had to change the entire bed. But I've been changing nappies for years, and it was just that kind of,
brain fog.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if we are suffering with a little bit of sleep deprivation, how useful is it? Because you hear different bits of advice. How useful is it to have a power nap, even if it's like 10 minutes, 20 minutes in the afternoon, there's little top-ups? What does that do to the brain, and is that a useful thing to do?
So that depends. I think if you're a parent, you have to sleep when you can. The only time I don't suggest power naps is if somebody has insomnia and they're struggling to sleep at night. If you're struggling to sleep at night for no other reason, let's just say you don't have kids, even though this is a podcast aimed at dads, then I don't recommend power naps. You have to save all your sleep for the night sleep because that's the most refreshing sleep you can get. But if you're a parent, you really have to see where in your schedule you can replenish. And if having a nap is not affecting your night's sleep, then I'm all for it. There's no issue with that.
Because sometimes I'm just stood there and I'll just start breathing. My eyes might be open or closed, but I'll just be snoozing. I could be in the supermarket. I could be here with Matthew on this podcast, and I'll just grab
Makes a lot of sense, actually, from the
grab a
podcast
quick
we've
10
done.
minutes.
Yeah.
And then as soon as it's over, I'm recharged, I'm ready to go.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. What impact does social media have on our brains before we go to bed? First question. And second question, do those glasses that everybody wears, those blue light protecting glasses, do they work?
So blue light before bed, a bit of a myth in terms that it disturbs your sleep. There was a hypothesis. Big one. There was a hypothesis that blue light is going to suppress our melatonin, which is a sleep-inducing hormone, and stops us going to sleep. Studies don't really show that. And if they do, they show that it's a number of sort of small amount of minutes, which is neither here nor there. As a neurology doctor, I don't say to people, oh, those extra couple of minutes, are amazing. And so all the new research data doesn't show an effect of blue light on our sleep. Our devices are quite dim. So even though they emit blue light, it's not to the strength that would confuse our brain. Our brain has evolved to be outdoors and have really large amounts of light. So a tiny dim phone screen is not really doing anything for your brain. There's a different question is when it comes to the content that you consume. So sometimes a lot of the content can be quite psychologically alerting. Think about stressful content and social content. And that means different things to different people in terms of what people may consider stressful content. But if you are watching something that you subjectively find stressful, then your cortisol levels can rise. This is a stress hormone, but it's also an alertness hormone because at times of stress, we need to be alert. If you're being chased by a wild animal, you need to be alert. You can't be snoozing. And I certainly feel that effect myself because sometimes I do overnight, 24-hour on calls, and I'm woken up with an emergency in the middle of the night. And those times I feel so alert that I cannot get back to sleep afterwards. Versus if I was just woken up by, let's just say, I don't know, a small noise, I still feel quite sleepy and be able to go to sleep after. So just important to avoid stressful content. And then a lot of social interactions can be quite unpredictable. Sometimes they're stressful, but even when they're not, they can be quite psychologically stimulating. So a lot of the new studies show that watching things passively in bed is not a bad thing. Sometimes it stops people ruminating, especially people who may have mood disorders, anxiety disorders. They might be thinking on a loop. Their mind is wired about things to do with work or things to do that are disturbing them. Watching calming, passive content is not a bad idea, a bit like reading a book. And I know, for example, just to give you some examples of things that people have told me, some people like to watch comforting shows like Friends before they go to sleep. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. Studies show that it can be part of our wind down routine.
Can it help you? I've read that before. Like laughing before bed can help you sleep better. Is that true?
It can
Old wives'
do.
tale, that, Matt.
Yeah, possibly. I think it's a very individual thing. But I think what you don't want to do is, like I said, stress yourself out. Something comforting, things that you've watched before are a really good idea, because the other thing that we tend to do with our devices is we tend to procrastinate going to sleep. And you can either procrastinate before you get to bed, so being outside your bedroom and doing things rather than heading to bed. But even when you're in bed, you can procrastinate actually shutting your eyes and going to sleep by doing various things on your phone. So when it comes to using phones before bed, it's not a complete no-no from the neuroscience point of view, but avoid stress, avoid social interactions because they can be a bit unpredictable, and avoid using them in a procrastinating way. Yeah,
I always thought, again, if you watch, social media, or you do something that kind of has your visual and mental consumption of it stimulates your nervous system and upregulates it, so you're into more of a sympathetic state. And I've always found that kind of, in my mind, would be something that would disturb sleep. But likewise, this problem-solving part of the brain, again, this critical thinking, this prefrontal cortex being highly active before bed, I always thought of those being things that would disturb sleep. And so I've been looking at pre-sleep hygiene, of down-regulating the nervous system, of trying to avoid content that would possibly switch those areas on. So I'm into pre-sleep meditation and down-regulating. And I'm really interested in what happens to the brain actually when we meditate. Over to you, Doctor.
So let's talk about the long-term impact of meditation. So one of the things that it does, it reduces the emotional reactivity of the amygdala. This is the emotional brain, the hub of the emotional brain that we talked about. Yeah. So, when you are sleep deprived and the coffee machine goes wrong, you're less likely to get such a big spike of amygdala activation, just to make it more directly applicable. Yeah. You're less likely to get such a big reactivity. That's good, because that's less for your intentional brain to deal with. But at the same time, it tends to increase capacity of the executive brain. So in a way, you have it both ways. You're reducing the reactivity of the amygdala, you're increasing capacity of your executive brain. And this can have a whole host of benefits. Emotion regulation is one, but for example, being able to focus is another. And it can improve sleep as well. I think with sleep, the thing that you want to do is you want to have a predictable, consistent routine before you go to sleep, because your brain links certain things when it comes to sleep. And, it can link smells. Some people use lavender, but it doesn't have to be. It can link environments to sleep. And that's why we find it harder to sleep in a really strange room. So having some consistency in that relaxing routine is important.
So one last question I want to ask you about meditation. And this is the big one. This is the big question for me, because it kind of links into mindfulness. What part of the brain is the part that observes our thoughts? So when we meditate and the thoughts are coming and going, we're like, oh, that's a thought. I'm just going to observe it with no judgment and let it pass. What part of our brain is observing that?
That would be the executive brain, the intentional part of the brain. So that part of the brain both thinks, but it also has something called metacognition. And that is a superpower that we have, particularly as humans, where we think about thinking. So we don't just think, we can observe, we can analyze our thoughts, and we can do various things with them. And both these things are in the executive brain, which is not necessarily the largest of all mammalian species, but it's the most developed in humans. And that's why we have these abilities.
Faye, it's such a shame, because I've still got another 30 questions that I'd love to ask you, but we're going to have to wrap it up there. For anybody who wants to know more about you, where's the best place to go?
So I'm on Instagram. That's the platform I use the most. I'm at The Brain Doctor. So that's the_brain_doctor. But also, if you search my name, Dr. Faye Begeti, then you can find me on my website or LinkedIn or other social media platforms. And of course, my book.
And of course, The Phone Fix. Massive congratulations on the book, Faye. You've been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Faye.